Greetings, book lovers everywhere. I'm E-Train and welcome to E-Train Talks, where I discuss everything books in the hopes of inspiring others to enjoy reading as much as I do. Today, I'm very happy to be talking to author Amanda Rawson Hill about her extraordinary, beautiful middle grade novel in verse, The Hope of Elephants. It didn't take me long to read The Hope of Elephants. It's just that good. It's a story you feel like you just can't walk away from. It pulls on your heartstrings, and I felt like I had an obligation to come back for more. And I'm so glad you can join me on E-Train Talks today, Amanda. I'm thrilled to learn about your writing journey and your process in everything books. So thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
I'm excited too, and I'm so thrilled that I can talk to you about your books and just everything books. So I did a little research about you, and I read that you actually grew up at the library right out your back gate, which seems like a pretty awesome experience. And I also read that you have a degree in chemistry. You don't hear about many middle grade authors having degrees in chemistry. And I read that you're also a homeschool mom. You do a lot. And I think it's so cool that you're kind of a multitasker in a sense, which is just awesome. And I can also relate to having to like homeschool moms because my mom homeschooled me this year and it was a pretty interesting experience.
Yeah, it's I wear many different hats. And when I was in college, I thought I wanted to be a chemistry teacher, and then I thought, no, I'll work in a chemistry lab, and neither of those things worked out. I just didn't work out for various reasons, and then I had kids, and things happen, and here I am writing books.
Yeah, so you really are a jack of all trades. And before we get into my questions about The Hope of Elephants, I'd love to find out if growing up so close to a library had any impact on your writing or love of books.
Oh, for sure. Like you said, and like my bio says, it's literally, we would just walk out the back gate and cross the road, and there it was. I have such fond memories. We'd go every week, just walk over, sometimes multiple times a week, for the different story times and the summer activities. And we were friends with the children's librarian, and it really shaped me as a reader. But not only that, as a lover of books, because I was so, I think, spoiled with such a good library and great children's librarians. I walk into libraries these days with very high expectations of a children's section and the children's librarian, because I experienced such a good one. And so I have such a passion for making sure that these book spaces for young children are as inviting and warm as mine were.
Well, it sounds like such a fun experience, just being able to walk over to a library, have all the books that you'll ever need. That sounds like a dream come true. And and I think that having a really good children's librarian that kind of cares for all the readers, I think that can really set the foundation for a career in writing or just becoming a lover of books. And I think that it's not really you're spoiled. You're just lucky, and you're super lucky to have the right people, and you were like kind of in the right place at the right time. And it's always good to have a great children's librarian, because kids need to find somebody that can kind of teach them to love books, and that's kind of the job that the children's librarians have. So finding one that can really carve a passion for a kid, that's just amazing.
Yeah, for sure. And when my first book came out, thankfully Miss Vicky was still there, so I could give her the news. She retired shortly after, but that was one of my big things. Is I was like, I have to go tell Miss Vicky at the library about my book.
And you made it. You did it.
Yeah.
So my first question about The Hope of Elephants is, The Hope of Elephants is a thoughtful and meaningful coming-of-age novel in verse that deals with the sensitive subject of a loved one suffering from cancer. And even though your novel is realistic fiction, you include many facts, and as well as information that is true to the real world, like chemotherapy. How much research did you put into writing The Hope of Elephants, and what resources did you use for information?
That's a good question. Because so many of the events were based on things that happened in my family with my sister, my brother-in-law, and my niece. A lot of that information just came from, watching them, hearing, what their schedule was, what the medicines were that they were taking. And so that was a lot of my research, was just talking to my sister about what was going on. As far as like with the elephants, I did a lot of searching on the internet. There were lots of news articles within a span of a few years about this research and the elephants and the doctor who was doing it. And because of my sister and my niece's genetic testing and that she had, they had like the pamphlets. They had access to these things that they do for kids with leaf-armites. And so that was another outlet that I used for research, of course, the internet, like I said. And then I actually joined a Facebook group for friends and family of LFS, of people with LFS. And that was a great tool for resource, because there were times when I'd go in and ask a question like, hey, what is a kind of cancer that you can be on maintenance chemo for several years, and perhaps live 10 or 20 years on chemo, and so they would give me these answers, and they would tell me, what are the kinds of things that scare them? What are the kinds of things that they think about, that they talk to their kids about? And I also just saw lots of people's stories. For instance, when I first wrote that first poem in The Hope of Elephants, the first lines when she says, my dad gets cancer in all the odd years of my life. I was worried that made us kind of exaggerating it a little bit for the poetic purposes, which I kind of was. But as I joined this group, I realized that it really wasn't that much of an exaggeration, that there are families who have very much an experience similar to that. And so just reading lots of family stories really helped me understand the gravity, the different ways that the mutation shows up in people's lives, the different way it affects them, and how families deal with it.
My next question is one that I like asking a lot of authors that I talk to. So what's your most treasured part of The Hope of Elephants?
I still don't have a good answer for this. You told me you were going to ask this question last night. I was like, oh, shoot. I don't know. It's so hard to choose one, because it really depended on where I was in my own grief journey with what happened to my brother-in-law and my sister and my niece. Now that my family is 5 years out from the death of my sister's husband, I would say, okay, I'll just tell you my favorite poem. How about that?
That's okay.
My favorite poem in The Hope of Elephants is Terminal. And it's where she compares the idea of being told that you have a terminal disease, that you are terminal, that you're going to die, with an airport terminal, and sitting and waiting for your plane to come. And that is my favorite poem. And because I just love the parallels that it draws to waiting and not knowing and feeling anxious. And so I loved that one. I also, I'm gonna say two. This one's kind of hard. So, spoiler alert, just a little spoiler alert. The very last poem of Hope of Elephants is, as you know, a bookend with the very first poem about crossing a bridge. And when I wrote it, I was just thinking that I was just bookending it with one event in her life where she, biked across the Golden Gate Bridge with her dad. But when my sister read it, shortly after her husband had died and her daughter had been diagnosed with LFS, she read it and she said, oh, this means Cass dies in the future, doesn't it? And I was like, I didn't mean to say that, and I would never say that that's the interpretation, But that's how my sister, who's going through it, interpreted it. And so for me to realize that there were parts of it that maybe I didn't intend, but that subconsciously were in there to give others I think the message and the meaning that was that they were ready for. And that's really special to me to find out that subconsciously I weaved in more meanings than even I realized I was going for.
Well, that's always the best feeling.
Yeah.
And I think that you really did a great job with weaving in hidden meanings, adding more depth to the story. And I think that your poems, they were really incredible. One that really stuck out to me, like the way that you used parallels, like you used it many different times, but it's one technique that I just thought was perfect. It perfectly fit the Hope of Elephants. And the one that I appreciate the most is probably when the main character kind of Cass compared being being okay, not having the P53 gene, to having it, like the way that that she believes her life will progress. I think that the two parallels, I think it's probably the most meaningful, like, thing that in your story, because I also love the way that you change how the poems kind of look. Like for sometimes they're straight down vertically, but also they have to be jig-jaggy sometimes. And I think that you really reflected the story with your poems. And I'm in awe of your poetic style, I have to say.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. We're going to get to this a little bit later, but that was one of the reasons that I wrote it in verse, was to be able to put that message there without taking up too many words.
Yeah. And throughout the story, you've interwoven sensitive and at times pretty sad themes. Was writing The Hope of Elephants difficult to get through emotionally at times? And if so, what did you do in those situations?
So, interestingly, writing The Hope of Elephants was therapeutic, more than difficult, because I was having the difficult emotions. I was asking the questions that Cass asks. I was struggling with the idea of how unfair it was. And I was watching just this really sad thing play out. And so coming to the page and being able to write it down wasn't necessarily difficult. Like it was more like a relief. Like I could finally say it. There's a poem in there where Cass goes into her closet where it's dark and she says, "It's only here where I can say it. My dad is dying." And that came from the last few months of my brother-in-law's life. We all knew that he was dying, and he was dying quickly. But, and I've seen this play out several times, my sister and her husband were in a bit of denial, understandably. They couldn't quite face it, and so we weren't really talking about it. We weren't talking about what was coming or how to deal with it. We were kind of pretending like it wasn't there, and it was so hard on me. I was like, we're pretending like it's this big secret, but he's dying and this is happening and we need to face it. And so it was difficult emotionally to experience it myself, but the actual writing of it was like a release. So I would say it was actually very therapeutic for me to write it, more than difficult. I would say the most difficult part of it was because it's so personal. It was very difficult to have it rejected by publishers before it found a home, because it felt like a personal rejection, like they were rejecting my story, my feelings. And I'm not sure if I got through that in a very healthy way. I think I just put my head down and tried to write something new so it wouldn't hurt quite so bad.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I really understand how The Hope of Elephants is therapeutic, because just getting your thoughts out on paper or maybe on digital paper I think that it can really kind of make sense of the situation. And I've talked to a lot of authors, and a lot of them say that their stories are therapeutic, and also just being rejected, it can really hurt a lot. And I'm so glad that you found a publisher in Charlesbridge where you can kind of share your story. And because the Hope of Elephants deserves to be shared, it's just so meaningful and so important. And I think that the story that you just shared in your answer to my question, I think that it's kind of just wow. Like, it's so hard to really face the fact that something is really going wrong, and hide, hiding from the situation, that's really never the answer. And I think that the Hope of Elephants, it really reflects like real life and adds a lot of depth, because the situations that Cass is going through, they're happening to you too, and it's just so poetic and really important that you got your words out on the page. And my next question is, if you could meet one of your characters, who would it be? And what's something you'd say to them?
That's a good question. I think if I were to meet one of my characters, I think I would actually choose the dad. And I think I would talk to him about just how hard the end can be and how important it is for him to be honest with his family and make the most of the time he has now, just because it's very hard to see people suffer and not be able to talk about the important things because they can't face them. And I understand it's so hard, but those opportunities can get lost so quickly. And so I think that's what I would want to talk to him about.
Yeah, and that's such a great message to share, because we really need to be honest, and that honesty, kind of just letting the truth off your chest, because hiding away, it just makes the pain feel even worse. So letting everything just come out and telling the truth, I think that that's really therapeutic, and it's kind of a relief, like writing the Hope of Elephants. Just writing your truth or telling your truth, it can really just be the start of something new, and it can also kind of relieve a lot of pain off of you. And I think that what you would share with the dad, I think that he would really take it to heart, and he'd tell the truth right away to Cass. And I'm just kind of in awe of your answer. And I'd also want to talk to the dad. I'd want to just right away, when I found out what was happening in the story, that a lot of things were going to go wrong and fast, I would just want to jump into the story, tell Cass the truth, like just be there for all of the characters. And I think that your answer is very meaningful and it's just so great. And some of the meaningful themes found in Hope of Elephants are family, friendship, courage, and forgiveness. Are these themes you often try to include in your writing?
I don't know if it's necessarily that I tried to, like, I don't think I think about it, but they definitely show up over and over and over again. So my first novel, The Three Rules of Everyday Magic, forgiveness is a huge part of the theme. And I always have family and friends in there, and courage. And so forgiveness was a huge part of The Three Rules of Everyday Magic. And I have a book coming out in 2023 called Once Upon a Family. Obviously, it's about family. There's also friendship, but forgiveness, making things right is a huge part of the ending there as well as courage. And so I think I'm really drawn to this idea of forgiveness and making things right, especially between parents and children. I find that shows up over and over and over again in my writing.
Yeah, and I think that having those themes, those messages, those reoccurring messages show up in your writing is really, it's just really interesting how they always find their way just weaved into the storyline. And I think that those messages that you share, I think that they're probably my favorite in middle grades. So, like seeing them interwoven into your novels, it's just very enlightening and makes me smile. Like this person wants to write with these themes just like me, and finding somebody who really, like, I also think it's really inspiring how these themes kind of find their way from the brain to the paper without you even knowing. And
Yeah.
I think that I would kind of describe that as like the writing groove where everything's kind of flowing out. And I'm honestly, I really want to read the 3 Rules of Everyday Magic and also Once Upon a Family after hearing your brief descriptions without spoiling anything.
Well, hopefully you enjoy them.
Yeah, I know I will. So, why did you decide to write The Hope of Elephants in verse? And do you see yourself writing more novels in verse?
That's a good question. It's my first verse novel, and so far it's my only verse novel. Um, for me, the subject matter has to be just right for verse, and the story arc has to be more internal. So I'm going to answer your question backwards. I have tried to write 2 other books in verse. I've kind of started them, written so many pages, and then asked either my agent or critique partners, like, is this working in verse? I'm just not sure. And both times I think it would work better as a hybrid with prose and verse. And every time that was because they were getting so dialogue heavy. So a lot of times verse novels, if there's a lot of dialogue, it's really hard to make that work smoothly in a verse novel. And so what was nice about The Hope of Elephants is that so much of it was just internal, and that's part of why it worked. I chose to write it in verse for 2 reasons. The first one was that when I started hearing Cass's voice in my head and the words, I just started thinking, this sounds like verse. Like she's talking to me in verse. This is not a prose novel. And so that was my first clue, was how the voice came out. And the second reason was when I first had the idea, I had this picture in my mind of a girl who's been split into 2, and both sides of her are running at the same time. And at the end of the book, they run into a room and they converge into one person again, in a hospital bed. And you'll recognize that happens kind of in the book. And so when I was first kind of thinking about it, I was like, okay, so am I going to have, is it going to be like this kind of speculative novel where she has like 2 sides of herself and she's seeing the future or whatever? And then I realized as the verse was coming to me, and as I started typing it out, I realized what I could do with the formatting that would show this dichotomy of having 2 different futures, possible futures in front of you, and that I could show it visually on the page without having to hardly say a word about it. And so I really like that idea, and that's what really cemented writing it in verse for me.
Well, I think that's really interesting. And I think that I really want to see more of your novels in verse. Finding that right character, I know that you're eventually going to find the right character again, the right cast, somebody that speaks to you in verse. Like, and also, I think that Hope of Elephants, I just kind of read it in verse. Like, not only was it a novel in verse, but like you said, Cass's voice was in verse. Very poetic and also kind of telling the truth. And I think that verse novels, they do a great job of kind of, each page may be short, but each page says enough. And I think that The Hope of Elephants really fits the verse kind of genre. And like the description says, it's perfect for readers who love Starfish and Red, White, and Whole. And I think that I honestly feel like all verse lovers will love The Hope of Elephants. And everybody, if you love verse novels, you're going to love The Hope of Elephants. I know that a lot of people in the writing community have raved about it. And when we had a novel in Verse MG book chat on Twitter, which if you haven't heard about it, it's very fun. It's a very fun experience. A lot of people talked about The Hope of Elephants in response to the questions. And I know that that probably made you smile.
It was wonderful.
Yeah. And I know that there are probably going to be tons of people who read it even before September when the novel comes out, because it just deserves the recognition.
I hope so.
Yeah. So do you have any other book projects in the works? I know that we talked about Once Upon a Family, but do you have any others?
So Once Upon a Family is the only one that I have a publishing contract for. I'm working on selling more. And I'm really trying to right now get into the nonfiction market, nonfiction picture books, because of my chemistry background. I feel like that's something I can leverage and use. So I have, like I said, I have some STEM picture book series that I'm working on. And then of course I have the next book that I'm hoping will sell once I can send it to my editor is kind of, it's a homeschool, it's a large family homeschool story, similar to the Vanderbeekers. So if you imagine the Vanderbeekers living in California and all being homeschooled, that's sort of the idea of what I was going for. So I really love it. It's much more lighthearted. You know, no one is sick or dying. And everyone is mom's about to have a baby, and it has some funny guinea pig stories from my life, and so fingers crossed that someone wants that one, but that's what's in the works.
Well, if I was a literary agent or just a publisher, I would want to publish that novel because it sounds so great and relatable, even if you're not homeschooled.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah, fingers crossed, knock on wood. So, is there a particular novel that you've cherished since you were young?
The first novel that really hit me, and I remember thinking, this is my favorite book, was Walk Two Moons by Sharon Creech. So I love that one. It's interesting going back and reading it as an adult rather than a kid, because there were a lot of things that as a child that I didn't understand quite what was happening. I didn't understand quite what was being said. But it's a beautiful book that even when I read it as an adult, I'm just blown away every time. It's just perfect. So Walk Two Moons for me.
I'll have to look into Walk Two Moons. And having a story that you can really relate to and come back to, even as an adult, I think that's kind of the definition of a perfect novel. And just being that safe space that you can go back to over and over and over again, that is just the best feeling. And that leads me to my final question of the day, the one that I ask every single author, everybody that I talk to. If you could be or meet any literary character, fictional or real, who would it be and why?
I would have to say, and this is probably a boring answer, but I would have to say Anne Shirley from Anne of Green Gables. I just love her. And whenever I decide that I'm going to read the series again, I go through the whole thing, and I just feel like we would be kindred spirits and we would be best friends. I relate to Anne Shirley's just dramatics and her imagination and the things she loves to talk about. So I would love to meet Anne Shirley because I know that we would be bosom friends, as she says.
I would love to meet her as well. And now, since that was my final question, it's time for a little bit of an exit, everybody. Just a little summary of what we talked about and what's to come. So thanks for all of your insightful and thoughtful answers. I just learned so much, and I'm so grateful that you could come and talk to me today, Amanda. And
Thanks
I
for
know that
having me.
everybody on E Train Talks listening is grateful too.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And everybody, you need to read The Hope of Elephants. I'm serious. And it's just such a powerful read. Like, I don't really have I'm at a loss for words because there's not one word that can really describe The Hope of Elephants. And I think that Cass could probably describe it, but it's just hard for me to describe because there's so many aspects, so much poetry, just so much going on that I loved that I can't really think of one word, one brief sentence to describe it. I could go on and on about The Hope of Elephants, really. And I don't want to leave without sharing that when researching Amanda online, I happened across another book of hers that I have to mention because it looks amazing, like all of Amanda's works. It's called The 3 Rules of Everyday Magic, which I hadn't known about, and I'm so glad I found it. It looks like another extraordinary middle grade must-read that I've added to my reading list. And that's it for today, everybody. It's been so special for having Amanda on my podcast. Thank you for talking books with me.
Thank you. I'll see you later.
Yeah, see you later. I hope you'll come back in the future and talk more. And everybody, thanks for listening. I hope you have a great day. And remember, be sure to pre-order The Hope of Elephants. And I know that when it arrives in your house in September, you're going to just sit in your reading nook and read it all day. And also, I know that some people have ordered it for my book drive, which is in the works right now. I'm going to be donating all the books to kids in need because The Hope of Elephants, I think that everybody needs to read it. And that's why I added it to my book drive because it's incredible. And yeah, that's all for now. Like, really, that's all. I don't have anything else I'm going to say. Keep following Amanda Rawson Hill on Twitter and her website. Info in the description. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.